I'm not really sure why I bothered getting my hopes up for this one. Lord knows I've been wary of the MCU's lack of direction post-Endgame, but I was cautiously optimistic for Secret Invasion. Yeah. The initial trailer promised a back-to-basic spy thriller about a cloak and dagger plot, ripe with deception and paranoia, and centered around one of the most iconic yet underutilized characters in the Marvel Universe, Nick Fury. Some of my favorite entries in the MCU thus far have come from the espionage side of the franchise, with entries like Captain America the Winter Soldier and Black Widow, employing the tropes and trappings of spycraft to wonderful effect, and Secret Invasion looked as though it would be of the same pedigree. If ever there was a pitch to renew my passion for the MCU, it was this. However, after watching the first 2 episodes, hell, it might have even been 3, I was left a little cold. While they had sown the seeds for an intriguing conflict between Fury, the Skrulls, and the US government, these ideas didn't really seem to be going anywhere. If this was going to be a 6-episode season like all of the Disney Plus Marvel shows, then I'd expect to have a pretty firm grasp of the premise within the first third of the show. But by the end of episode 2, it still wasn't clear what the show was supposed to be about, and as a result, I just sort of lost interest and checked out. And that probably would have been all I had to say about the show. That's it, close the book, and we'll never talk about this thing ever again, had I not been foolishly convinced to pick it back up weeks later. Over the following weeks, I started to see more positive reactions to the show cropping up all over the place. People saying that while the show had admittedly had a slow start, it had found its footing and become the show. People were saying that it was the best MCU show thus far. Then again, they tend to say that about every new MCU project, but regardless. So against my better judgment, I decided to catch up right after the finale premiered to just binge the whole thing, not have to worry about waiting week to week. And I don't know what I was expecting, quite frankly, because despite the hype, I can now safely say Secret Invasion has officially killed my interest in keeping up with the MCU. I think I've just reached a point where I no longer need to watch every single one of these things. I'm going to evaluate it on oh, does this look cool? Yeah, sure, and then we'll go from there. And look, to be quite honest with you, I'm still unsure about whether or not Secret Invasion is the worst thing Marvel has ever produced, but it's certainly in the conversation, and it's absolutely nothing short of disappointing in all the same ways the vast majority of these Disney Plus projects have been. Proof positive that this franchise is not about to find its groove anytime soon. But you know what franchise is finding its groove is Lord of the Rings, and this video is brought to you by The Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth is a tactical turn-based squad builder set in J.R.R. Tolkien's iconic Middle-earth. You can reunite the dynamic duo of Legolas and Gimli and see which one will kill the most orcs, and when they team up in-game, they do extra heavy damage to their enemies. As a traveler from a faraway land that has reached Middle-earth, you discover a previously unknown ring of power. After putting it on, you cause a rift in the timeline and must now work with Arendelle, the Mariner, to heal the rifts and restore the timelines to a single continuum. Collect iconic characters from all eras of Middle-earth to create your own squad and experience iconic moments as you explore new, never-before-told stories with your favorite heroes and villains. Meet the elves in Rivendell, battle the Nazgul atop Weathertop, and do it alongside Frodo, Sam, Strider, and many more iconic characters in a unique Middle-earth experience. When you make your own fellowship, you can use awesome solo and team-up abilities that can change the course of battle. So fly, you fools! Download Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth for free using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code with your phone right here on the screen. And thank you so much to Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth for sponsoring this video. The most glaring issue I noticed when jumping back into the series at episode 3 is just how much Secret Invasion fails to function like television. Yeah, I know. This long movie syndrome has been a recurring problem across Disney Plus's output, but I think Secret Invasion might just be the most egregious example yet. Individual episodes don't really function as their own stories, but rather like fragments of one overarching story. Even for serialized television, this is so unusual. For example, shows like Succession or Andor aren't episodic by any means, but each episode has its own narrative arc, with a distinguishable beginning, middle, and end that contributes to a bigger overarching narrative. But the episodes that comprise Secret Invasion have no such structure. They're just amorphous blobs of narrative parts that only really make sense when viewed as a whole. This is perhaps most evident in the series finale, which feels like walking into a movie in the middle of the third act. The episode is pretty much just another action climax with some falling action at the end to tie up the narrative and set up ideas for whatever comes next. I can only imagine how disorienting it would have been to watch this show week to week rather than all at once as I did. Which brings me to another major issue with this long movie approach. There isn't nearly enough narrative to sustain over 3 hours of runtime. Nothing really happens in this show until the final 2 episodes. I mean, obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration, but ideas feel stretched to the absolute limit. The conflict between Fury and Gravik is established in the second episode, yet it doesn't ever go anywhere. The two have a few encounters where they do little more than just vaguely gesture at a deeper conflict without ever really getting into the issue at hand. Gravik sees Fury as a false idol who made empty promises to the Skrulls in order to exploit them for his own professional gain. A valid criticism of Fury's actions concerning the Skrull refugees hiding on Earth. He did offer to help, only to use them as part of his spying network while never actually fulfilling his promise to find them a new world. Yet, Fury never really has to grapple with this betrayal. We never get an admission of guilt from Fury or an explanation as to why he did what he did. The final episode makes you think we're finally getting some kind of payoff for this conflict, with Fury admitting to his misdeeds and expressing a deep regret, but this turns out to be a big old fake out, with Gaia merely impersonating Fury to play a gambit. It's such a goddamn massive misfire, but it kind of encapsulates the entire show. The only thing less coherent than the plot of this show were the attempts at political commentary. Much like Falcon and the Winter Soldier before it, Secret Invasion wants to be a serious political thriller, but it is seemingly unaware of the implications of the ideas it's engaging with. I'm not exactly a big fan of Captain Marvel, but its decision to reframe the Skrulls as refugees rather than arch-villains was a genuine stroke of genius. Secret Invasion wants to tell the next chapter of this story, further exploring the plight of the Skrulls as they search for a new home. However, the show also wants to adapt one of the most iconic Skrull stories, hell, the most iconic Skrull story of all time, the titular Secret Invasion, a story in which the Skrulls are an unambiguous threat to mankind, portrayed in a manner reminiscent of conspiracy thrillers like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and They Live, shape-shifting interlopers hiding in plain sight. However, in trying to have their cake and eat it too, Secret Invasion inadvertently stumbles into some pretty uncomfortable subtext, depicting refugees as a threat to the people of the places they seek asylum. Just gross. What the hell are you thinking? Especially with today's political what? The show tries to have it both ways by reassuring us that not all Skrulls are this way, and that only a radical faction poses a threat. But this doesn't really change much in the grand scheme of things. It's a caveat that sounds nuanced on its face, but falls apart once you realize this is exactly the rhetoric xenophobes use to stoke fear about integrating refugees, a sentiment that isn't backed up by the data, which shows that refugees aren't any more dangerous than naturalized citizens. And you might be thinking, who cares, it's just a comic book show, and I'd be more inclined to agree if this show hadn't intentionally positioned itself as a serious political thriller. Hell, they tried to pass this off as Marvel's answer to Andor in the lead up to the premiere, for God's sake, which is, oh god, that's so embarrassing to think about now. And a fundamental non-negotiable component of a political thriller is the politics, so I kind of feel like it's fair game to point out how unintentionally reactionary the politics of this show end up being. And yes, I said unintentionally, and I know it's unintentional because the show clearly thinks it's a story about how a few bad apples risk stalling progress, as is made explicit in the way the show frames the conflict between Gravik, Gia, and Talos. However, this intention is undermined by its attempts to marry two incongruent depictions of the Skrulls. One of the perils of an interconnected universe is that you have to play the cards you're dealt, regardless of what the source material says. Captain Marvel deliberately framed the Skrulls as refugees, yet Secret Invasion wants to tell a more book-accurate Skrull story, and so it tries to combine two ideas that actively contradict one another to bewildering results. What's even more frustrating is that the show gets dangerously close to actually recognizing this contradiction and using it to say something interesting. Towards the end of the final episode, the President of the United States declares that all off-world species are to be considered hostile forces and vows to round them up and remove them. This aggressive, othering rhetoric leads to acts of violent vigilantism as paranoid humans start to hunt down individuals they believe to be Skrulls, resulting in the execution of Skrulls and humans misidentified as Skrulls across the globe. This provocative sequence is a striking reflection of the way political rhetoric has been weaponized to incite violence against marginalized groups in the real world. The mobs hunting down Skrulls evoke images of Charlottesville or anti-trans mobs trying to identify trans people who they believe are deceiving others by receiving gender-affirming care. The problem is, this sequence is less than 5 minutes of the show and takes place in the final 10. Guys, what are you doing here? Come on. It's nothing more than a setup for a subsequent story, but its inclusion only draws into focus just how shallow the rest of the show's attempts at political commentary really were. I admire the writers for finally showing some teeth, but it's the textbook definition of too little too late. But beyond the politics, Secret Invasion simply fails to be an interesting spy story. You'd think the presence of shapeshifters would make for an easy layup in the intrigue department. You've got characters who are capable of mimicking literally anyone, meaning anyone could be an infiltrator. The potential cloak and dagger subterfuge is endless. Yet, Secret Invasion very rarely plays in this paranoia inherent to this setup. We're very rarely left guessing who is and isn't a Skrull for all too long. Once a character is introduced, we're pretty much made aware of their true nature within a few scenes. Take Rhodes, for example, the most prominent cast member revealed to have been a Skrull. Rather than letting the question of his affiliation linger throughout the series, we're told in episode 4, long before the final confrontation between Fury and Rhodes. While this allows Don Cheadle to ham it up a little more as an overt villain, it pretty much saps the story of any and all ambiguity. Imagine if Fury had his suspicions about Rhodey but couldn't prove it and had to negotiate the tension between his instincts and his uncertainty. That's the conflict good spy stories are made of, yet Secret Invasion repeatedly opts to forego it altogether. In addition to that, the implication that Rhodey has been a Skrull since Civil War feels like such a fucking slap in the face to the people who have been invested in this character. Hell, not even the character in this cinematic universe, which I'm assuming is all of you listening. Sure, Rhodes has never been a major player in these films, but robbing this character of his development over the past 5 years, retroactively making it so that he wasn't present for Tony's death and other major events, feels like such a cheap move. Moreover, it cheapens his role in this series as well. We get some really great interactions between Rhodes and Fury, particularly their first encounter in the restaurant, and much like the fake-out confrontation between Fury and Gravik in the finale, those scenes are far less interesting in hindsight, knowing that Fury was just talking to some Skrull he'd never met. Another issue with the way the Skrulls are utilized is that they're a little too good at blending in to be compelling foils. Unless they're acting out of character in a very obvious way or actively morphing shape, you can't really tell who's a Skrull and who's a human. So when someone is revealed to be a Skrull, it feels a little arbitrary, as do the deaths in this show as well. I mean, just look at Mariah Hill and Talos. I mean, good God, poor Mariah Hill, poor Colby Smulders. Oh God, they just really said fuck off. Good spy stories are like a good detective story in that the mystery needs to feel fair. If the detective pulls a conclusion out of thin air at the end of the story, and it's something the audience couldn't have possibly guessed, the audience winds up feeling a little cheated, like they were being intentionally held at arm's length to preserve the twist. This same logic applies to spy stories. If there aren't little clues the audience can pick up on to detect subterfuge, then it feels a little cheap. You start to see the hand of the writer withholding information to unfairly trick the audience. There aren't nearly enough reveals in Secret Invasion to make this a prominent issue, but in the few instances of individuals being revealed to be Skrulls, it feels unearned. Again, why do a paranoid intrigue plot if you aren't even going to bother with double crosses and deception? It just feels like a wasted opportunity, a feeling that is compounded by the way the story devolves into a schlocky CGI spectacle by the finale. Secret Invasion wants to be a spy show. It's selling itself on being a more gritty espionage thriller, but it has no idea how to be one. So instead, it just falls back on the same tired tropes of the superhero genre, really worn out at this point. I realize the concept of super Skrulls is from the comics, but it just feels so incongruent with the tone of the series to that point, and ultimately feels like an ancillary objective to Grovik's overarching plan to pit the human race against itself. I mean, it's just people playing with action figures in a finale. I mean, they've already been joking that it's like they ripped off the finale of Free Guy and put it in the MCU, which is like the bleakest, grossest statement I could possibly ever think of. Like, what are we doing here? Come on, guys. It just feels like an excuse to indulge in the same mind-numbing spectacle that all these Disney Plus series always descend into in their final episodes, in a show that really shouldn't be treading into that territory. After the first episode dropped last month, it was revealed that the opening credits of the show had been created using an AI program, a fact that was immediately obvious to anyone with eyes. But beyond the gross disregard for the work of the artist this decision represents, I think it is a perfect microcosm of the problem at the heart of Secret Invasion. In an interview with Polygon, executive producer Ali Salim suggests that the decision to utilize AI was in fact an artistic choice intended to reflect the uncanniness of the Skrull interlopers around whom the story revolves. And although this is likely a half-truth designed to justify a cynical cost-cutting measure, I think this explanation is very indicative of the entire series. An ugly, politically ignorant product that thinks it's cleverer than it actually is. Ultimately, Secret Invasion is just another example of the MCU being unable to get out of its own way to tell interesting and resonant stories. Despite my issues with Marvel's approach to storytelling as of late, I've actually quite enjoyed a fair bit of the MCU, but a lot of the time, my investment has been in spite of the MCUism rather than because of them. And Secret Invasion is just the nadir of these issues. All the narrative and thematic problems that have plagued this franchise in recent years come home to roost. This series just plain wore me out. I'm exhausted. And after the high of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the punctuation point on my emotional investment in this cinematic universe, because I thankfully got an Ant-Man 3, and I'm like a massive Ant-Man fan, and so I was like, all right, Ant-Man 3, don't need to see another one of those, great, I'm done. Guardians 3, cool, I'm done, we're done. I think I'm about ready to get off the ride now. Hell, I barely mustered the strength to see this eye-rolling snooze fest through. I hope the MCU can find a way to right its course, but for right now, man, I think I'm gonna pass on the Marvels and beyond. Who am I kidding? You know I'm gonna do videos on those anyways. Ugh, fuck me. Ugh.